Assalamu alaikum. So, this is probably the most controversial issue and debatable issue between the two groups, those that had permitted that women go and visit the graves, and those that completely regarded that women should not visit the graves at all. And of course, you got the third group that said, no, they can visit the graves, but with certain conditions. So I'm going to talk about each and every single one. But it's important to understand that these three opinions are considerable opinions, and to deny that any of the opinions is somehow an un-Islamic opinion, an innovation, and to somehow be so fanatic about one opinion and disregard the other, I would say is definitely creating a division within the ummah and being too fanatic towards and limited towards one interpretation and denying that the other interpretations do hold some weight within the Islamic interpretation. Great and important scholars have also adopted these opinions, and therefore to regard them as an innovation or to disregard them and completely reject the other opinions is really not acceptable, because the second that we would regard such an opinion actually means that we had considered our own interpretation to be the only Islamic interpretation and to be the only acceptable interpretation, and then, of course, ostracized the rest of the Muslim interpretations on not only on this matter but also on other matters, because it really stands on the same idea. Let me go to the actual question. So scholars actually had differences of opinions. The reason for that is because in the beginning of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ did indeed prohibit the Sahaba from visiting the graves, and he literally said, كنت قد نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور ألا فأزوروها. I had prohibited you from visiting the graves, now visit it, فإنها تذكركم بالآخرة, for it reminds you of the hereafter. Now, when you look at this hadith, which is an authentic hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ literally had said that there was a time where he had prohibited them from visiting the graves, and the reason for that was because during the pagan times they were so connected with the belief that the dead had some kind of correspondence or some kind of a religious connection, a spiritual connection with the Lord Almighty. Therefore, visiting the graves and connecting to them was somewhat still engraved within their mindset. So the Prophet ﷺ had forbid them from visiting in order to end such belief within them. In other words, it was a pagan belief. It was really to purify them from such belief in that regards. And then later on, the Prophet ﷺ said, now visit it because it reminds you of al-akhirah. So now it became into a different type of a spiritual connection where you're visiting the graves not because you believe that the dead have some kind of a spiritual connection with Allah Almighty, but instead you're connecting yourself with the akhirah. You're connecting yourself with the dead, that one day you're going to be in their place, that this is inevitable, and that this is what you should prepare yourself for. That's why the sunnah when visiting the grave is to say, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'minun, دار قوم المؤمنين أنتم السابقون ونحن إن شاء الله بكم لاحقون. And where you're saying, Assalamu alaikum dara qawm al-mu'mineen, peace and blessings be upon the house of the believers. You had preceded us and we will later follow. So this is in order to connect you between your life and the akhirah. Now, the second piece of it is when the Prophet ﷺ actually said, لَعْنَ اللَّهُ زَوَّارَاتِ الْقُبُورِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had cursed زَوَّارَاتِ الْقُبُورِ, the women that visit frequently the graves, visit the graves frequently, or is it here the word zawarat, this is where the place that scholars really differed about. So the first group of scholars, they took the word as literally meaning that if they're visiting frequently. The second group of scholars, they said, well, if frequently or frequent visitation is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cursed, when you're talking about a frequent visitation being a bad thing, that actually means the partial visitation is also abhorred, is also not acceptable. So therefore, they took that word, and the debate went into that. How do we understand? Do we include the women in the first hadith where at one point they were prohibited, now they were permitted? Was that exclusive to men, or was that inclusive to women as well, where they were included within that hadith? How do we understand that? So that's where the debate is. And you might think, well, why couldn't they agree? Well, you want to keep in mind that there are different stages and gradual development within the Prophet ﷺ's tashri' or legislature in general. So this was actually a part of it. This is a piece of it, and there were different understandings. Do we understand this as exclusive to women? Do we understand that this is actually only considering the women that do it frequently, or the women that behave in such ways that was very similar to the pagan, whether they were ripping their clothes, or whether they were exaggerating in screaming and slapping their faces and just somehow trying to exaggerate that the drama and the trauma that they were living in. So that takes us to the third opinion that actually considered that it is permissible for women to visit the grave on a condition that she would regard the different regulations, whether it's not being too dramatic, too traumatic in the way that she's visiting. So she's not ripping up her clothes, not slapping her face, and probably screaming and all of that, but she's taking it in as a moment of silence, as a moment to do that realization of akhirah, taking it as a moment to do the dua for the deceased, to do a dua for herself as well. So what do we mean by doing the dua for herself? Because part of the dua is that you would say, Allahumma la tahrimna ajrahum wa la taftinna ba'dahum. Ya Allah, don't prevent us from getting the reward of being patient after their death and after losing them, and don't make us from those that will fall in some trials after their death. In other words, keep us steadfast in our faith. So therefore, the grave visitation is really to include a dua for them, a dua for yourself, and a connection with the akhirah, a connection with the hereafter. So just wanted to lay those opinions out. So to summarize, opinion number one is that women should not visit the graves, period, and that is a sin. Opinion number two is that women can visit the grave, and that they're actually included in the generalization of the hadith where it said that they can visit the grave. Opinion number three, they agreed with opinion number two, but they included, well, as long as it's not frequent visitation, and of course they emphasized on the regulations that we had mentioned earlier. Assalamu alaikum.